Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Strictly Education webinar. The focus of this afternoon's webinar is working together to deliver internal scrutiny. We have quite a lot of people on the session with us today, so just a couple of housekeeping points first of all, if we may. Hopefully you can all locate the go-to toolbar. If you haven't found it so far, there'll be a little orange rectangle with a white arrow floating somewhere in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, it will open the toolbar for you. And on that toolbar, you'll find the little document icon, which enables you to download the handouts. There's a copy of all the slides we're going to share with you this afternoon, as well as an ebook that we've put together on internal scrutiny for you. You can download those anytime now during the webinar itself or immediately afterwards. You will also find on there a little button with the word questions written on it. If you click on that at any time, it will open the dialog box and allow you to submit your question. Please do use that. We'd like the webinar to be as interactive as we possibly can. So if you have any questions, just hit the submit button once you've typed them in, and they will magically appear in front of us, and we will do our level best to be able to respond to those for you. If for any reason we're not able to respond live on air, we will get back to you very shortly afterwards electronically. And last but by no means least, you will see a little hand icon there. If you can hear me okay, if I could ask you just to signify that by raising your hand and by clicking that icon, I'd be really grateful. Thank you very much. I can see lots of you doing that now. Lovely, that's just about everybody's done that now. That's great. So I'll save you the effort and put your hands back down for you. And with no more ado, we will actually kick off the session. So as I say, a very warm welcome to this webinar. My name is Steve Barker. I'm the Head of Governance Services at Strictly Education, and I'm the guy on the right-hand side of your screen. The plan was I was going to be joined by my colleague Steve Bulmer, who's the guy on the left of your screen there, who's the head of our, Group Head of Finance Services at Strictly Education. Unfortunately, Steve's been taken ill today, and he's had to run off and get a COVID test this morning, so we're hoping it's not going to come back positive, but he's not feeling particularly well, so he's not able to be with us this morning, I'm afraid. But I will do my level best, and I've got hopefully Steve is on the other end and can send me messages if I go off piece, so to speak. But this is your session, so please do keep those questions and comments coming as we're going through, and we'll do our level best to be able to respond to those for you. Sorry, it went forward too many slides there. The aims of this session today are first and foremost really just to explore what the duties and the expectations of Academy Trust Boards are in specific relation, of course, to internal scrutiny, which is why we're all here this afternoon. But what we want to do is take a look at it really from the perspective of how does internal scrutiny work as a process that involves not just the Chief Executive Officer as the accounting officer for trust, but also the work of the Chief Financial Officer or the School Business Manager alongside the Audit and Risk Committee. Hence, we've called this session Working Together, because our view is very much that internal scrutiny should be a joint effort. And it's also important to say, of course, it's an ongoing process, but we'll say a little bit more about that as we go through the session today. And as we go through, what we want to do is think about the scope of the internal scrutiny process and hopefully bring some clarity to that, and how it links inextricably with the role that risk management plays as an ongoing part of trust business anyway. And this, of course, is all tied up in this aspect of compliance, which of course is a responsibility of the trust board and the CEO together. So those are the areas that we're going to try and cover as we go through the session. But as I say, please, questions, comments at any time, and we'll do our best to be able to respond to those for you. So just a few words really to think of what is internal scrutiny. And I think internal scrutiny, for me, the answer to that question in terms of the work we do with trust boards through my team, and Steve Bulmer, I've spent a lot of time talking about this. This is very much an evolution. Since academies existed in the form in which we know them now, since the 2010 legislation, we all know that we had the choice of having a responsible officer, or we've had an internal audit function. Internal scrutiny is not the same as internal audit, and we just wanted to make the point here that this is very much a continuation on from that process, but it has evolved and actually now encompasses a far wider role and a far wider remit that trustees certainly need to be aware of, but also to recognise their own responsibilities in terms of compliance, and of course factor into that. But this is something that the Trust Board does rely on a very solid, rigorous and robust working relationship with the accounting officer and of course the finance team in the Academy Trust. So in terms of where we are as far as the definition goes, the Education and Skills Funding Agency, which of course is an executive agency of the Department of Education itself, issued some guidance in July this year, non-statutory guidance, but nonetheless it's actually quite a helpful document, and I would thoroughly recommend it to anybody if they're not familiar with it. And it does give us what comes as close as we'll get to a definition of internal scrutiny. And it says here that internal scrutiny is a process, and I think we've stressed that already. It's a process that provides that independent assurance to the Trust Board that both its financial and other controls and risk management procedures linked to that are operating effectively within the Trust. So the key for us here is to actually stress that point. It's not simply financial, it is about other operational controls that contribute via that risk management process to giving the assurance that trustees in turn need for as the Trust Board, but also to pass on that assurance to the Education Skills Funding Agency, Companies House and other people that of course we are as a trust operating not just with probity, but we're operating effectively and efficiently as well. As far as the compliance aspect is actually concerned, then of course, we've actually got the Academies Financial Handbook, which hopefully all of you will be very aware of, alongside the funding agreements that exist for our trusts, are those contractual responsibilities as well as what the Educational Skills Funding Agency has actually set in terms of a list of must-dos for Academy trusts. And the handbook this year replicates the same message that came out for the first time in 2019, and that is that all trusts must actually have this program of internal scrutiny in place, and that the aim of it is to provide that assurance that we've talked about, that independent assurance to the Trust Board, again, both on its financial and non-financial controls within the context of risk management. So that function, of course, can be provided in a number of ways. Now, I know we've got colleagues joining us today from a variety of trusts. Some are standalone trusts, some are significantly large multi-academy trusts, I should say. And of course, how we do this is again dependent on the size of our trusts and is actually spelled out in the Academy's Financial Handbook. So if you are a trust with an annual turnover of less than 50 million, you still need to have the function, but you don't need to have a dedicated committee. If your trust has a turnover of greater than £50 million per annum, then of course you do need to have a audit and risk committee as a standalone committee that actually meets of its own volition, so that it can take fully the responsibility of internal scrutiny within its remit. And as far as the specific duties and the expectations that the Education Skills Funding Agency and the DFE as a whole has actually put in place, and these do come, as you'll see at the bottom of the slide here, the reference is from the current Academies Financial Handbook. Section 3.5 is actually talking about the independence of the internal scrutiny process, and again, independence always precedes the word internal scrutiny when we're talking about the requirement. And it's saying here that it must be achieved by establishing appropriate reporting lines whereby those carrying out the checks are reporting directly to a committee of the Trust Board itself. And of course, the whole point of that it is providing that assurance that we've been talking about to the trustees on the board. 3.9 makes the point here that employees of a trust should not be on that audit and risk committee. So although it is perfectly acceptable for academy staff to actually attend governance, trustee, whichever word we want to use, committees, meetings, etc., employees of the trust themselves can be there in an advisory capacity, but they are not members of that audit and risk committee. But of course, the whole point of today's webinar really is to explore how that joint working should actually be undertaken from a best practice model, and what that might actually look like in reality from both the trustee's perspective, but also from the perspective of the CEO stroke accounting officer, and also the chief financial officer, because it will be their role to provide an awful lot of that assurance, perhaps to do some interpretation of what comes from the internal scrutiny process. So there is a list of requirements for the Audit and Risk Committee. It's quite a lengthy one, and we've tried to summarise them to get them all predominantly onto a single slide here. But a lot of these make common sense and actually fall within the remit of perhaps the broader interpretation of governance rather than school governance function that we're talking about here. And of course, any committee ought to have terms of reference. It is a must here, and of course if it says must, then there isn't a choice. This is actually part of the statutory obligation that a multi-academy trust or a standalone academy trust will have with regards to discharging this particular function. There must be written terms of reference. There has to be a work programme that guides and directs the internal scrutiny process over that annual cycle, and that has to be agreed by the Audit and Risk Committee. Now, there's an obvious one there, of course. Is it the role of the Audit and Risk Committee to draw up that work programme? No, but certainly we would expect that to be done in collaboration with possibly the internal scrutiny provider, but certainly with the input from the accounting officer and also from the chief financial officer or school business manager. There is an assumption here, of course, that a risk register is in place in all of our trusts already. If it isn't, that ought to be a matter of absolute priority. But the risk register itself should inform what that work programme that's agreed on an annual basis actually looks like, and certainly should be driving some of the priorities for the internal scrutiny process. Part of the responsibility of the committee is to agree what comes out of that work programme, who is actually going to undertake the work, and how that's actually going to be done. Now, we're not going to go into the decision-making process about how you actually organise internal scrutiny in your individual trusts this afternoon, I should say. But of course, there are different options there. Our preferred view, quite clearly, because we are a provider of internal scrutiny, is that it is an independent external provider as the best solution here. But however you do it in your trust, there is a responsibility on the Audit and Risk Committee, or the committee that's actually fulfilling that function in a smaller academy trust. The responsibility, of course, is to ensure that this is not a one-off event. It is an ongoing process, and at every part during that cycle, and we'll come on to the cyclical nature of this a little bit later, but at every part during that cycle of internal scrutiny, progress is reviewed and reflected on, and it is also the role of the committee, of course, to ensure that any recommendations that come out of that process are being addressed and actions actually put in place on an ongoing basis as well. It is the role of the committee, the Audit and Risk Committee, to consider feedback from other assurance activities as well. And we're going to spend some time towards the end of the webinar looking at perhaps the scope of internal scrutiny, but by the very nature of that definition that we've actually looked at a few moments ago in the current version of the Academies Financial Handbook, we know that it isn't just about financial assurance activities, and there may be others such as governance reviews, health and safety audits, things like that, which actually come as part of that process. But again, they're all still aimed at providing that assurance that appropriate controls and processes are in place within the trust. And lastly on this list of musts for the Audit and Risk Committee is that they must also have access to not just the provider of internal scrutiny, but certainly the external auditor from the perspective of how some of those outcomes from the internal scrutiny process may have influence on the audit of the annual reports and accounts, but also a requirement that it's the Audit and Risk Committee that has to consider the quality of the organisation or the individuals who are actually conducting the internal scrutiny process on behalf of the trust. And that's probably very similar, I would suggest, as a parallel in terms of external audit. It is the responsibility ultimately of the members, but clearly the trust board, and very often that might be delegated to a resource or a finance committee, will look at how satisfied they are that the external audit provider is delivering value for money, is actually delivering a good service that provides the assurance that trustees want. Exactly the same is true of this process that we have here. We've got a question or a comment that's actually come in here from Catherine that's come up on the board. Catherine's actually saying the CFO is often a member of the finance committee, so if the audit and risk is actually covered as part of that committee, it has to be clearly minuted that the CFO is not a member during those discussions. Absolutely, Catherine, and I think you're absolutely right. If you have a trust with, as I say, that turnover of less than 50 million, and you've made the decision to actually make this almost a subset of your finance or your resources committee, then yes, I would suggest that you need to make sure there is some very clear distinction, maybe even a separate set of minutes that actually shows that people there, from the point of view of indicating their independence, are shown as in attendance as opposed to members of that committee, irrespective of whether they are members of a finance or resources committee. So thank you for that point, Catherine. Okay, let's move on at that stage. We did say that a little bit earlier that this is actually a cyclical program, and it's a cyclical program that does at every stage of it involve joint working. And what I've done here is just take one example of one of those tasks that the Audit and Risk Committee or the Audit and Risk function is actually responsible for, and that's the idea of agreeing an annual work programme. And what we've done on this slide is just reference that in terms of an ongoing process. So if we start where my cursor is at the moment on the orange box at the 12 o'clock position, first and foremost, obviously what we want is risk register or the risk management process to be central and fundamental to everything that there is to do with internal scrutiny, and that risk register should be scrutinized to actually determine what the priorities are. We then move into the drafting of the work programme for the Audit and Risk Committee. We're then into perhaps a review of that, approval of the programme, and ultimately this idea that obviously the actions that are undertaken as part of that programme are put in train. The whole process of internal scrutiny is actioned and results in results in a report being issued, which then forms part of the next iteration of that programme of risk management, which then starts the cycle all over. And if we then put into place, hopefully my animation works, which it does, clearly part of that scrutiny, the origination of that starts with the Chief Financial Officer stroke school business manager. The initial work that goes into that, of course, is actually going to drive the programme. Some of that may well involve discussion with the external provider of internal scrutiny, but that's going to start within the finance team within most trusts. When we get into the drafting of the work programme itself, then the CFO stroke school business manager will obviously be talking to the Chief Executive Officer in their capacity as accounting officer, and we would suggest a good working model there is that at that stage the chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, or if it's done as a function of another committee, the chair of that committee also gets involved. Then of course when we're looking at the draft, that goes to the Audit and Risk Committee, and ultimately that draft is actually going to be approved, hopefully without too much modification, by the committee itself. And of course then we are actually into Sorry, my animation seems to have gone a little awry on that slide. Hopefully you can see that, but clearly what we're talking about here is the process is actioned by the internal scrutineer or scrutiny company or organisation, and of course then part of that means that we get to that report being issued, and that takes us back into the programme at the starting point. Oh, sorry, it just paused. I do apologise. Okay, so at that stage, obviously what we're doing then is thinking about, okay, we've got our work programme, but where do we want to go with this? What should the scope of internal scrutiny actually be as far as we're concerned as an audit and risk committee, as a trust? And what I've done here is taken a screenshot of one of the pages out of the Strictly Education Internal Scrutiny ebook, which is one of those handouts that you have available to download as part of this webinar this afternoon. And these are just some of the areas. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination at all. What this does is give you an idea of how the risk profiling, the risk management within the trust is actually going to shape the process of internal scrutiny. And again, every trust will have its own individual context, and some of these will be more appropriate than others in most trusts. Now, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading this slide out to you. You can see all the things that we've actually got detailed here. And I think the key for us is to say that from the perspective of Strictly Education and the internal scrutiny team that we've got, what we would do, of course, is be working with the Academy Trust to actually not just define what the scope of the work is, but to actually identify how we can actually add value to that process. And of course, the adding value comes from the experience that we bring to this process by feeding in best practice that we're actually developing as time goes by, but also sharing ideas, best practice that comes from the scrutiny role that we actually find ourselves engaged in other trusts as well. And I think from a trustee's perspective, of course, what we should all be looking at here is every process that we're involved in the commissioning of delivering the added value that we would want from from that particular procurement. Okay, and then what we need to think about here is the how this is actually linked to the risk management process, because as we've said right from the top, risk management itself is an ongoing process in all of our trusts, and what we should be doing is ensuring that not only is that informing internal scrutiny, but also is actually driving it and is seen as an iterative process that is constantly being updated and informing not just discussions at trust board, but also actions within the trust on an operational day-to-day basis that seek to further address those risks. As I've already said on that last slide, recognition here that every single trust has its own very distinct risk profile, and that's something that hopefully all of you will have had a discussion about in the past, and that will include obviously that discussion about risk appetite. But what we do need to ensure from a trustee's perspective, and that assurance will come from the accounting officer, but also from the CFO or the school business manager, is that we've got a process of internal scrutiny that is being driven by that risk register. It's actually being updated on an ongoing basis, and the risk register itself is actually part of that cycle, and the scores that end up actually being attributed to the risks identified within the risk register are influenced by every iteration of that internal scrutiny process itself. And the next few slides are again taken from our internal scrutiny ebook and just talk about this risk management process from the perspective of our view of best practice in this area. And it has to be said that our view of best practice is actually driven in part by what comes out of the Department for Education, the Educational Skills Funding Agency, but also by the outcomes, sorry, I should say, from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. And it has to be said, we have a member of our team, Shola Ajose, who is actually a member of the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. And we believe that what we've done here is created what is a best practice model of internal scrutiny, which would actually put multi-academy trusts and standalone single academy trusts in a very strong position as far as that assurance that this process should actually deliver to them. So, like many other aspects of internal scrutiny and risk management, we have a process here that actually is a cyclical one. So we start off again at the 12 o'clock position. Risk management is about identification first and foremost. What are those risks that potentially could actually present themselves or manifest themselves in a way that actually ends up causing damage to the Academy Trust? And clearly that is a process that can be quite time consuming, but nonetheless should look at all aspects of the trust operation and the impact of not just finance, of course, but also those reputational risks that sometimes are actually overlooked by academies. Once we've gone through that process of identification, obviously then we have to think about how we measure those risks. How do we enumerate them? Are we using a RAG rating system, red, amber, green, etc., that gives us the trust as a whole, but certainly gives the trust board the assurance that the risks have been identified, and part of that way of actually responding to those risks is to actually give them some form of rating. So we're measuring them and we're actually making some judgments about the significance of them. Once we've done that, of course, we then have to make some decisions about how we're going to manage those risks. And we're going to come on to the management of risk in just a few moments in terms of what we do on an individual basis. But once we've made some decisions about how we will manage those individual risks that have been identified, we then have to set up a process, of course, where we're monitoring the way in which we have decided or determined to actually manage those individual risks that have actually been identified in the risk register. And of course, any form of monitoring serves no purpose at all unless it's actually reported on. And obviously that report should be part of that ongoing work of the Audit and Risk Committee, rather, because actually it is that ongoing reporting of the monitoring activities that then should be used to inform the process of internal scrutiny. And typical risk assessment process would involve us actually looking at two elements of every single risk that we've identified. One is the likelihood, in other words, what's the probability that this is actually going to present itself as a risk, and secondly, actually measuring that against the impact it would have were it to actually manifest itself. And the risk matrix that we use within our service here is a 5-point scale, going from very low through low to medium to high to very high. And you can see the color coding that we've got on this is intended to be indicative of the RAG rating that's used throughout the process. Red, of course, at the top end there. Again, we've got numbers attached to all of these, and you will see that obviously if you have very high combination of not just likelihood but also impact, clearly you're going to be at the top end of the red scale there. And similarly, if you've actually got very low risk compared to very low, sorry, not compared, but alongside very low impact, that's going to be at the bottom left at the number 1. And of course, every single risk, when we go back to, sorry, this answer. So in terms of measuring that risk, this is the process that we're talking about here. So we would actually be thinking about the measurement of likelihood versus the measurement of impact, and then we would actually create a risk matrix, which ultimately becomes the risk register for every single one of those. And obviously you can add them all up and get an overall risk measure for your trust. But what we're talking about here is looking at it on a more individual basis, of course, because that's how we end up managing the risk. And if we move on to the management section, again, this was the third area of that flow chart that we looked at 2 slides back. And we believe that there are 4 key ways that we can actually respond or manage those risks that we've actually identified and measured within the trust. Doesn't matter where we actually start here, but I'm going to start at the blue one top left. First thing we can do is actually say, well, okay, this is a risk that manifests itself, but it's something that we can actually tolerate. And if we're tolerating a risk, what we're really doing is saying, yes, we're recognizing it, but we're just going to continue to do business, to continue operating as an academy trust in the same way as we are, recognizing it's there, but we'll retain it and do nothing other than that. The next option, of course, is when we think about the green segment of this drawing here, we're actually going to treat, we're going to respond to the risk by either trying to control it or reduce its impact in some way. And this is one of the key areas, of course, where we will want to ensure through the feedback that certainly is presented to the Audit and Risk Committee, that whatever we put in place to try and mitigate that element of risk there, or what we're doing in terms of control or reduction, does actually have an impact. And that's the kind of thing that we would be wanting to monitor on an ongoing basis. And that's where that process of internal scrutiny could perhaps be directed to look at some of those areas where we have actually decided to do something in terms of a response. Same will be true, of course, where perhaps we've got some risks which we believe are incredibly high impact and therefore high risk that we don't want to tolerate. And so what we're actually saying we want to do here is actually to terminate or eliminate that risk completely. And this is obviously very much directed by perhaps the appetite for risk that certain trusts will have, and some of us will be wanting to avoid risk completely. Others will be far more about perhaps somewhere in between accept and reject. But here we're deciding that this is a risk that we do not want to bear, and therefore we are going to put actions in place which look to completely eliminate or avoid as far as we possibly can that element of risk. And we've got a question coming here from Toby, and Toby's question is, to what extent should internal scrutiny responsibilities be conducted, replicated by individual local governing bodies within a MAT, or is this just a trust level obligation? That's a very good question, Toby. It is an obligation, it's a statutory contractual obligation on behalf of the trust. I would suggest it's for the trust board itself, or certainly through the Audit and Risk Committee, which will have delegated powers given to it by the scheme of delegation from the trust in the first place. It's for them to determine at what level this goes down. Clearly, a lot of the risks won't just apply to the trust board. They will actually be, first and foremost, they'll be shared and they'll be owned at individual schools within the trust. So I think at trust level, decisions will need to be made about how those risks, I think it's very pertinent to this slide we're on at the moment, whatever the response is to the risk, and some risks may only apply to certain schools within the trust, others may be slightly more generic in nature and apply to every school within the multi-academy trust. But wherever we're identifying the risk, if we are saying we want to treat it in a particular way, that will need to be monitored at school level, whether it's the trust that does that through some kind of compliance mechanism or whatever other forms of assurance are sought. Reporting on this would come back to the Audit and Risk Committee and ultimately to the trust board, of course, but it would be for every MAT to decide what they wanted to put in place in terms of those local procedures and processes, I guess, to govern this. I hope that answers your question, Toby. I've got another question here from Mark. Mark is saying, how should we quantify the impact of risk? That, again, a great question there, Mark. I think, again, some of this will actually perhaps be influenced and advised by your internal scrutineer if you need them to be, but for an awful lot of us, this will come down to probably a common sense analysis at the end of the day that says, well, what is the impact on, let's say, the continued existence of the trust? And one of the risks that you might identify perhaps relates to financial probity, or another one might relate to Ofsted outcomes, for example. The impact of either of those, if there's major financial issues in the trust, and let's say the worst possible scenario might be that the trust is victim of significant fraud, the impact of that is significant and may end up with the trust actually being wound up or potentially pulled apart and rebrokered into other trusts. Similarly, with Ofsted outcomes, you might have the same thing. So it is about individuals saying, well, okay, what is the impact here? Yes, that is fairly catastrophic and that threatens the very existence of the trust. That clearly is at one end of the spectrum, and that's going to put you into red territory as far as RAG rating is concerned. Other risks will not be the same. I think there has to be some acceptance, and again, this is where as an organisation we would be in a position to advise trusts that there is a sliding scale here that needs some proportionality, but there has to be a consistent approach to the way in which that impact is measured. So thanks for that question, Mark, and again, I hope that does actually respond adequately to that. One more question here from Rebecca. Rebecca's saying, how did other academies manage their scrutiny obligations for last year when we were in lockdown, particularly when most of the programme was due to be delivered in the latter part of the academic year? I think that's a great question, Rebecca. Certainly our experience to date is that trusts were in various stages of developing their programmes. And yes, you're absolutely right, not all of them will have been quite as smoothly implemented as they might have been because of the COVID-related lockdown. The date of submission has actually been pushed forward a little bit in terms of reports back to the Education Skills Funding Agency this year, but notwithstanding that, a lot of these processes can actually be done at arm's length. Or some of them would have been possible to do under lockdown conditions when schools were partially open, etc. So I think the process this year is actually changing probably quite significantly because trusts are far more aware of it now than they have been in the past. And I think because of COVID, as with all things to do with COVID, responsibility hasn't gone away, but I think there is a little bit of pragmatism hopefully actually creeping into the way in which the Education Skills Funding Agency will respond to that. Comment has come in here from Claire, and Claire's saying, I had a governor from the Standards Committee complete my spring internal scrutiny visit during lockdown, which we did via Teams and OneDrive to share the evidence. Yeah, thank you, Claire. That's a really good example, and that's very succinctly put in words what I was actually trying to explain there, so thank you for that. Okay, so back to how we're managing or making decisions on how we manage risks within the trust. We've talked about tolerate, treat and terminate. The last one we've got here, of course, is transfer. And when we talk about the transference of risk, what we're actually saying here is we're actually either getting somebody else to take on that risk on our behalf, and we might do that through a contractual basis. So, for example, one of the key risks that most of us will perhaps be very cognizant of is losing our internet service, losing our online backup, etc. All of those services, trusts are in a position to either manage themselves or to have them contracted out to other providers. And of course, if another provider is involved, there are very often service clauses in there, which do mean that there are emergency procedures that can actually be brought into place, but also that what's happening is somebody else is actually taking on that risk on your behalf. The risk can still manifest itself, of course it can, but realistically what we're getting here is a situation where it's at the very least being shared with another provider, and hopefully that does provide some form of mitigation for us. Or of course, ultimately, we can actually insure out a risk, whether that's actually done through the risk protection arrangements or through a separate insurance policy. Some risks can be insured against, and those would be risks of breakdown of key equipment, key heating systems, things like that within the multi-academy trust. Even key personnel insurance is a way of actually hopefully mitigating some of those risks that we might actually have identified. Okay, so let's move on at stage two. One of our other slides here, which actually again comes from the ebook, which is available to download with this webinar today. And this is just how at Strictly Education we've actually laid out our risk register. So once we've been through that process of identification, measuring the risk, quantifying them, etc., what we're then doing, once we've decided how we're actually going to treat each of those individual risks, is to identify them within the risk register. And hopefully most trustees who are with us on this webinar today will be very familiar with a risk register. It may not look altogether like this one that we're sharing with you today, but hopefully it will look something like this. Obviously this is a blank one, and what I've done just to get it on screen so that hopefully it's readable is to actually chop it in half. So if we look at the top portion of it, first of all, every individual risk is actually given a reference identification number. It is then put in a category as to which area of the trust's operation that actually falls into. And again, in a multi-academy trust, that may actually go down to even naming the individual school within the trust. We then describe the risk. We look at its impact, and again, this comes back to the question that Mark asked a little bit earlier about how we do make those judgments, but we then clearly identify and articulate here what element of our ongoing operation as a trust is actually potentially threatened by the presence of that risk. And then the primary risk itself, we then give it a score in terms of its likelihood, the likelihood that it might actually manifest itself, and then the score that we've given in terms of the impact that we estimate it might have. And obviously multiplying one by the other gives you that overall primary risk, and that's where we RAG rate it. So that's saying, if we do nothing, this is what that risk looks like at this point in time. And here we are on this element here where I'm waving the cursor around at the moment. We then think about, well, okay, we've now got to the stage on that flow diagram that we looked at a couple of slides back, where we're actually making some decisions about what we do with it. So what control measure, if any, do we want to actually put in place for this risk? We then move on to the second portion of the slide, the bottom part of the risk register here. We give a very clear explanation of what's going to be represented within that control measure. What are we actually going to do? What might the risk trigger be? What contingency plan are we putting in place? Who ultimately within the trust, and this will most likely be either the CFO / school business manager or accounting officer. It may be somebody else if it's a premises related risk, etc. But somebody needs to be identified as actually owning that risk, and therefore responsible for ensuring that those control measures and the contingency plan, etc., is put in place. And then that leads us to revisit it and saying, well, okay, if the contingency and control measures are actually put in place, what are we now saying that the residual risk is? So it's another visit back to likelihood and impact, and again, that will give us a risk rate, a risk RAG rating, which hopefully should be lower than the overall risk one. And again, that might be something we need to revisit over time. It may take some time until we manage to get to a situation where that overall residual risk is actually reduced. Okay, so that's a little trip through some of the resources that we have available within the internal scrutiny service that we provide at Strictly Education. And at that point, I just wanted to launch an opinion poll for you, just to actually perhaps get you to contemplate what we've just said and think about where that leaves you in your individual trust at the moment. So there is a opinion poll is actually hopefully launched on your screen now, and the question it's asking you to think about is, how does risk management within your own trust align to this model that we've just outlined here? You've got 4 potential answers, so if you wouldn't mind thinking about those and casting your vote, we'd be very grateful, and then we'll share the results with you very shortly. If for any reason you have difficulty voting at this stage, if you're in full screen mode, just try minimizing your screen for a moment. That should free up the voting panel and allow you to freely vote, and then you can maximize your screen again after that. Okay, so we've got about 2/3 of you voted now. If you'd like to vote, please do now, and we'll leave it open for a couple more moments before we close that poll. And you might just be wanting to think about, if you have any questions, then please do keep those coming along. I know we've had a number of questions already, but if there are any more before we finish, that would be the opportunity to contemplate those. Okay, so if anybody else wants to vote now, you have got about another 5 seconds, then I'm actually going to close that poll down. Thank you. A few additional people have voted there, which is lovely. Okay, I'm going to close that poll now and share those results with you. And they should appear on your screen anytime now. There they are. Okay, so we've got certainly a fairly evenly balanced picture on the first 3 that we put there, which is always a positive place to come from. So we've got 27% of you on the top there saying that you're confident at this point in time that your trust has a rigorous and robust approach in place to internal scrutiny. That's great news, and hopefully this session today has actually given you some affirmation, if nothing else, that you're actually in that position. 38% of you are saying that you have most aspects covered. Well, I hope that we've sown a few seeds for you and able to be a little bit thought-provoking and making you think about some of the other things that you might need to put in place. 28% saying that you're actually developing your practice at this point in time, and 7% of you are saying that you think you're perhaps at the start of a journey right now. Well, wherever you've come from as far as this is concerned, I mean, thank you for completing that poll. As I say, for us, the idea of putting this webinar together is not obviously to make you aware of a service that we provide, but actually to raise awareness of the concept of internal scrutiny and to get you to think about that in the context of provision that you have in place in your trust at this point in time, in comparison to what those upcoming statutory requirements and contractual requirements are for all trusts going forward. This is just a copy of the internal scrutiny guide that we've actually produced. This is available to download, so if you haven't downloaded this and the copy of the slides that we've made available to you today, you can do this anytime now and a few moments after the end of the session as well. That really just about brings us to the end of what we wanted to say, other than we hope that you've actually found the session helpful. We hope that if you've got any questions, please do get in contact with us. Let me just put the last slide up. I've actually put Steve at Steve Bulmer's email address. If you've got any queries on internal scrutiny at all, Steve is the key person driving this program through Strictly Education. Please do relay your questions to Steve or to myself, and if I can't answer them, I'll actually just field them to Steve anyway. But just to say thank you very much indeed for joining us for this session this afternoon. Thank you for your participating in terms of the questions. We hope you found this useful, and as I say, any more questions, please do get in touch. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.